Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Deb Myhoff with Communitas. I'm the facilitator for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Housing Actions Work Group, the HOG. Good to see you all again. This is our second meeting. Our first one was an orientation in December. A couple of things before I get into the meat of the agenda. We're jumping right in. That's one thing, which we'll do every meeting. It's a large group, so we won't do introductions, but I will point out the staff project team who are in the room here in a minute, just so you know who the resources are. And a reminder also, this is being recorded. It's really helpful if you've ever been on the recording side of things. It's really helpful when people talk to have their cameras on if it's possible. Otherwise, when you're watching the recording, you don't know exactly who's speaking, but I'll try to orient folks. If you can't have your camera on, I'll definitely orient. And then also, if you need some technical help, if you're having trouble with the Zoom call, hit us up in the chat. The chat is open to the hosts. Ingrid is the person who can help us or help you work out any sort of technology issues or issues connecting. And then we have some other staff in the room that can help bring comments to the floor if you're needing to do that through chat, but we don't chat between one another. And we'll have more as we get going. So I'm going to ask Mari to go ahead and pull up the agenda for today, share that with us. And while she's doing that, I'm going to do a quick round of introductions of the project team here, just so you know who the resources are. So I introduce myself, Deb Myhoff. I'm going to start with DLCD team. And Thea, why don't you give it a start and then please pass it on to one of your colleagues.
Hi all, Thea Croman. I'm a housing planner. I go with she, her pronouns, and I work on in the housing division at DLCD, leading this housing actions work group work with Celestina and Mari, who are here with me, and I'll pass it over to Celestina.
Thanks, Thea. Celestina Teva, she and they pronouns, also housing planner in the housing division at DLCD. Happy to be working with you all. Over to Mari.
Happy Tuesday. Mari Valencia Aguilar, she, they pronouns, housing planner at the department. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming back. I'll hand it over to Ethan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. My name is Ethan Suckmeyer. I manage the housing division at DLCD. Really looking forward to the conversation today, in the future, throughout the rest of 2025. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. And I think I saw Palmer, maybe. Palmer, are you there?
I am. Thank you, Deb, and good afternoon, everyone. Palmer Mason, interagency coordinator at DLCD. I'm just sort of hanging out, watching the conversation, and appreciate the time that everybody's giving to the effort. I'm not sure who I would pass it over next. Do we have anybody else for DLCD?
Yeah, we have a HOG member who is also DLCD staff, so playing two roles. Josh, maybe just introduce yourself real quick.
I'm Josh LeBombard, Southern Oregon regional rep for the department, and also lead regional rep for the department.
Thank you. Glad you're here. And then I have two colleagues on the consultant side of things. Madeline?
Everyone, good afternoon. I was almost going to say good morning. Madeline Miller with the Echo Northwest team, lead consultant, and I'll be note-taking today, supporting Deb. I'll pass it to Lorelei.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lorelei Johnson with Echo Northwest, supporting the DLCD team on this rulemaking process.
Great. Oh, yes. Thank you. And somehow we missed Ingrid, who makes this all happen. Ingrid, would you mind introducing yourself real quick? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Hi there, Ingrid Cordell, Housing Team Division Support for DLCD. Back to you, Dev.
Great. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Thank you all. So Mari, if you haven't already, could you pull up that? Thank you. Just the agenda slide, maybe the next slide. Yeah, great. So just to recap, we are going to have a presentation to start off. Well, first we'll talk a little bit about the racial equity framework for decision making. ground you in that, make sure we're really keeping that top of mind in our discussions today. Then we'll give you a presentation specific to adoption-ready actions. Again, just give you a bit of a framework on how the department's thinking about it and where we're headed. And then the bulk of the meeting today will be discussion with you all, and we'll get into some specific questions and mostly a brainstorming at this point, specific to adoption-ready actions. We'll take a short break in there because sitting in front of a computer screen or a phone screen for 3 hours is a lot. And then we'll come back and talk about the Goal 10 compliance pathway, sort of teeing us up for future conversations and wrapping up the meeting. Our goals for today are, as I mentioned, sharing the framework for adoption-ready actions and how that sort of fits into the Goal 10 program and the rulemaking for ONA. And then defining those terms and parameters of adoption-ready actions, the spectrum of what that might look like. And then exploring some and discussing some possibilities. So that'll be our discussion. With that, I'm going to keep us moving along and hand it over to, I think Thea's doing the racial equity framework today. Yeah, thank you, Thea.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Hi all. This is, sort of for those of you who've been rolling with us for the past year, you'll recognize this slide. For those of you who are more new, this is how we usually start out each of our meetings to ground you in DLCD's adopted racial equity framework for decision making, and use this really as the ground for any kind of policy discussions that we're going to have. Each of these 8 boxes has, kind of a whole series of questions that allow us to really dig in to some of the underlying questions that we might have about the decisions that we're making, and helps us guide those in ways that so we can avoid our blind spots. I'm not going to pull out anyone in particular for this conversation, because this conversation is so wide-ranging that it really crosses all of these sections. But I do want to just point to benefits and burdens, which is something that we should really keep in mind as we're talking about specific actions, and to make sure that we're considering the potential side effects, the potential externalities of any kind of actions that we are suggesting. Who are they benefiting? Who are they burdening? And again, just to address any blind spots we might have. I would be very happy to talk about this more, but I want to move into the conversation as we go through. What is really helpful is for us all to take moments where we can weave the conversation back to this framework, and just ensure that we're drawing the line through the whole conversation that we're having. So I am going to hand it now. Oh, actually, am I handing it to myself? Maybe I'm handing it to myself. Let's go into a little conversation about what are adoption-ready actions. And so I'm going to start with some definitions here. An action in current rule means a specific policy, code, program, investment, administrative measure, advocacy effort, or other tool included in the housing production strategy in alignment with statute, which commits to implementation. We're going to be building off of that in our working definition for adoption-ready actions. So for adoption-ready actions, it means an action for us right now. It means an action that is fully developed and implementable, and is immediately actionable. It requires little or no analysis or design before adoption into local plans, policies, or ordinances, and is designed to specifically reduce development resource needs while supporting the principles of Goal 10 housing. So I think we can have a conversation about that. It's a working definition. If you see elements of that you think we need to pull out or put in, let us know. But I don't want to get into wordsmithing right now. we're really talking about concepts at this point. So we can move to the next slide, Mari. The other framework that we're going to be using to address this conversation of adoption-ready actions, and really all of the conversations we're going to be having in the HOG, are the HOG policy objectives. And I wanted to run through these quickly too. The first, promote inclusive zoning to enable a diversity of housing options across types, characteristics, and locations. We also want to make sure that we're focusing on actions that produce and retrofit homes in high opportunity areas that increase housing choice related to equity driven needs. And, so these are things like affordable housing, housing accessible to people with disabilities, and anti-displacement. We want to make sure that that's the focus of the actions that we're taking. Streamline housing development processes, so reduce regulatory barriers, legal uncertainty, address lengthy approval process timelines, and so on. And finally, increasing community capacity and resilience in support of equitable housing production. And here, a lot goes in this category: efficiency in the provision of public facilities, cooperation across government agencies, risk mitigation, so addressing natural hazards, climate-related disasters, and different kinds of economic events, and also staff capacity at the local level. These are the intentions of this work, and so this is the framework that we're going to be using to sort of narrow the field of adoption-ready actions. I think we can move to the next slide. And Sean just jumped on. Are you ready to jump into this, Sean?
Yes, and also, hi everybody, sorry for being late. You'd think like when you're in the office, you'd be more punctual to things, but no, you lose complete track of time. So
none of us know how to do it in person anymore. It's confusing.
Yeah, but anyways, so I'm gonna hop in just to give a brief kind of like bookmark at the model code section. So I know we've talked about this already previously in the kind of orientation that we provided a little while ago now, but kind of in line with what Thea's mentioned on the adoption ready actions. Essentially, without going into too much detail, the model codes are kind of you could think of them as a legislatively prescribed adoption ready action or adoption ready actions, kind of depending on how you frame it. And essentially what it is, there's a bill, Senate Bill 1564, that kind of prescribes and provides funding for specific types of model codes that our office needs to produce for different housing types, for different city sizes. And then of course, we also need model procedures to kind of stitch it all together and make it work. Something I'll add, we're actually going to have kind of a dedicated do a deep dive into the model code later in February. Currently, we have our kind of consultant team that's been working on a kind of draft framework that will help kind of frame up a lot of the policy conversations, like what are we going to produce? What are we going to emphasize in the development of the model code, that type of thing. We're going to have a deep dive discussion next month. So if you are a model code or a code nerd like me, please feel free to join. You also don't have to if code is not your passion. But just something to know in today's conversation, something that I'm going to be listening for, just in line with the idea that we are not really starting from scratch here. We've already heard a lot from all of our different interested parties just about what our adoption ready actions should do. We're going to be continuing to listen for kind of general priorities and general things that we want these codes to actually do for incorporation into the model code. So that's something I'm going to be listening to today. Examples of things that we've already heard and that we plan to incorporate in the code just through our rulemaking process last year. We definitely heard about a need to really encourage and incentivize subsidized affordable development. So like making it easy for affordable housing developers to build housing is one of the goals that we should emphasize in this code. Integrating accessibility into the code and incentivizing the provision of accessible housing beyond just what is required in the building codes and providing incentives to do that. Aligning, we've heard a lot about the need to align with other kind of DLCD codes and resources that we have out there, things like manufactured home model code, the small cities model code, the walkability code that our colleagues in CFEC are working from. And then also, of course, I think just as a general concept, we've definitely heard the idea that this needs to build and support local capacity, especially for smaller cities with limited resources, right? We've heard the need at the HAPO level to make sure that a lot of our model codes are really easy to kind of plug and play for local governments to ensure that they comply with housing laws, and that we can do so without necessitating all this work, especially for folks who are really constrained at the local level. So I mean, this is not exhaustive. We're going to continue listening for more priorities, and something that I hope we get into the discussion today. I'll pass it back over to you, Thea.
And I will grab it and pass it to Celestina.
Thank you so much, Thea. All right, everybody. So for a couple of slides here, we're going to do a little bit of a look back. So part of the orientation for where we are today and in 2025 is, again, building from some of what we heard last year in 2024 and building off of some of the frameworks and programs that we have already been adopted in rule at the end of last year by the Land Conservation and Development Commission. So overall, these adoption-ready actions are, of course, in effort to promote the provision of needed housing. And there are two program elements to that. One is the HPS program, committing to actions, and is a plan and a commitment and a timeline. And then the acceleration program, which is about tracking those outcomes. So a more outcome-oriented framework aimed at monitoring progress and providing additional support. So those two applications, you could say, of these adoption-ready actions are the program framework to keep in mind as we think about what adoption-ready actions to prioritize for development and how those might be used and the impacts they might have locally. And in terms of developing these adoption-ready actions, there are a few things that we discussed last year to carry forward and also welcome continued considerations and kind of contextual reflections. But for now, just a few to highlight are that just the fact of developing these statewide adoption-ready actions is one way of minimizing local government capacity burden for development, and even even in action selection, right? And I'm kind of jumping to the third bullet point here, but the fact that these actions will be developed to adoption readiness, we anticipate it will be a natural encouragement or trend toward using these actions. So that's another thing to keep in mind as we sift through which actions to develop to adoption readiness. We will anticipate that they be used more widely. Oh, we'll stay back. Thank you so much. Used more widely than maybe any other random action that we might select from the HPS menu. And so with that, we are going to be aiming for a wide applicability and implementability for cities and counties across the state. So because we're aiming for this off-the-shelf, plug-and-play type tool, at a statewide level, that means accounting for, as best we can, different contexts and making sure that these tools can indeed serve that purpose is also something to keep in mind. That being said, where we are in today's conversation is a little bit higher level than some of those finer tuned questions about applicability across the state, but nonetheless something to just keep in mind as we explore where we might put most of our energy. And with that, Mari, let's go to the next slide. So continuing to talk about where we're building from, I wanted to offer a little bit of a review of what is already out there, and that will also help us continue discussion about where we might go. So on the left-hand side, some of you, perhaps not all of you, unless everyone read through every link in the agenda, might recognize this screen grab on the left-hand side. These are the categories of different types of actions that currently exists in what we call the HPS menu of actions that the department has already developed and released since the HPS program already exists. So as many of you have heard, revising and kind of revamping the HPS menu to have some more functionality, and even, filtering features and things like that, for better use at the local level, is something that we will be doing as kind of the last phase of this rulemaking to implement the programs into our guidance materials. So with that, just know that these categories are likely to be revised a little bit. We have already heard some ideas of other categories that might be worth rise to the level of needing to be added and things like that. But for the purposes of today, it seemed like a good starting place to sort of conceptualize the range of actions that cities might take to pursue their Goal 10 housing planning obligations. So we have an interactive activity up next where we'll be using those categories. And then to get a little bit more specific about different types of actions that fall in various categories, I just offered a few highlights of some of the things that we heard in 2024 that we've cataloged and are bringing forward for continued discussion today. So some of those, like Sean mentioned, are code related and could be folded into model codes. So some of the things we heard are inclusionary zoning, orienting to other affordable housing frameworks or thresholds for requirements that come into play for different types of affordable housing developments. We also heard, some differing ideas about what direction to take code, and switching to form-based code and not density-based code is something that came up, or even permitting by right all housing types in all residential areas. So we heard different ideas about where to take that. And today we're, again, kind of at this higher level where we'll be looking to hear things that maybe we've missed that we haven't heard yet, or hearing what types of actions y'all are most excited about and really that you think are going to meet the program goals. So what I'm getting at there is we don't need to get into super fine detail on any of these ideas, but we're looking to orient to what is capturing y'all's attention. So those are some of the code related items, and I pause there because there's a lot that can go into the code. And then we have different kinds of actions like ready build plan sets, like different incentive programs that are maybe oriented to a very specific type of housing need that could be in addition to a model code. We heard requests for tenant opportunity to purchase adoption ready action, a more actionable and thorough anti-displacement program. We also explored a lot in 2024 the idea of really operationalizing restorative justice, which was one of those racial equity framework for decision-making elements that Thea had up on the slide a little bit ago, and we weren't able to do that. So within what is required of this programming, we couldn't require a restorative justice housing production strategy process, but one of the ideas that emerged from that is that maybe there could be an adoption-ready action that a city could consider opting into that would utilize a restorative justice process for their work. And even a land back program oriented to housing that is specifically serving tribal populations was another one. So these are just some highlights, and you'll see them visually again as we transition here into our activity. Deb, can you remind me if we wanted to do clarifying questions now?
Yeah, that would be great before we launch into, thank you. Great. So staff have given you a lot in a short period of time there. I thought before we get into our brainstorming session, I would check in and see if you have any questions about adoption ready actions, anything they just said. I just picked up on one clarification, especially for those of you who are new. Often when we say the word cities, we mean cities, and then there are some counties also, our urbanized areas of counties, like our friends at Clackamas County who are in the room, are also in that captured in that word cities. So thank you. And then I also see a couple of you know the drill. If you have a question or you'd like to say something, raise your hand. I will call an order. And at some point, if you are the person who's raising your hand more, that's fine, but I'll always take people who haven't spoken yet first. So just so you all know how I'm going to run this. But Kathleen, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to get a working definition of inclusionary zoning, which is actually, my understanding is it's currently prohibited in Oregon law. So what is it and what do we have to do to bring it to pass?
Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, hi Kathleen. Just I'll paste the citation in the chat, but there's actually an authorizing statute for inclusionary zoning. It's ORS 197A.465. And essentially what it is an authorization. It was actually during the legislative history, it was kind of carved out specifically for the city of Portland, which really wanted to establish an IZ program at the time, and still has one on the books. And it's kind of designed around with specific requirements and specific incentives. You can establish a requirement to provide a certain amount of affordability in the units. From what I understand, there's actually no other city in the state that uses this statute. And so I think there's certainly possibility that refinements would be helpful to broaden this option for other folks to consider. But that's just the state of where the statute's at currently.
And just, pointing out too, the reason it was on the slide is because it's been brought up in prior meetings from stakeholders and community members as something that could be an adoption ready action item for consideration. Michael, please go ahead.
It's a process question. Is you use the word brainstorm. Would you prefer that we not refrain from objecting to anybody else's ideas as part of this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just making clear.
But we can, we can get there. And maybe if we have time, we can sort of talk about some of I think we can talk about some of the ones that maybe are more difficult to achieve than others. But yeah, let's do a real honest to goodness brainstorming at this point and then get there. So thank you. Mary Kyle.
I want to expand a little bit on the IZ response. As Sean said, the statute opened a narrow path to IZ that functionally really only works in the city of Portland, but it could work in other places. But it's for 20 or more attached units, which right there makes it not as useful in other parts of the state. And then there's other elements to it. But voluntary inclusionary zoning has always been available, particularly so often cities before, after, outside of any inclusionary zoning statute, often, conditioned development. If we're paying for the infrastructure, we want a certain percentage of affordable housing, or you get a density bonus if there's affordable housing. There's different ways of crafting voluntary inclusionary zoning, and cities around Oregon have done that in different permutations of it. So just wanted to expand on that aspect of it.
Good clarification. Thank you. Julia?
Maybe we will be getting to this in the instructions on the brainstorming, but I just wanted to either ask or suggest that where appropriate, folks differentiate if they're thinking of the HPS part of the process or the accountability part of the process when making recommendations, since that was brought up in the introduction, which I thought was great to just kind of remind us that there's kind of two phases to this. And there might be some things that folks kind of want or idealize living in both parts of that. But if it's kind of one or the other, I think it might be useful for all of us to kind of understand the thought process behind someone's recommendation in that way too.
Okay, thank you. I will, duly noted, we'll get into instructions here in a minute and I'll remind of that. Thank you, Julia, for that idea. I'm sorry, I'm seeing, thank you. Okay, looks like maybe there's some technical difficulties that are still being worked out. I'm just trying to make sure I didn't miss anything. All right, great. So any other questions about adoption-ready actions or sort of what the purpose of them would be? Just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. Okay, great. So we are going to transition formally into the brainstorming session, and to do that, DLCD staff have set up a Miro board. We're going to walk you through it and give you a little time to interface with it before we get into discussion. And to get us started on that, Celestina is going to give us the rundown on how that works. And I believe,
Oh,
if
and
it didn't
I
I think Thea already, we can copy it in again. I think, oh, she just did. Yeah. So there's a link in the chat to the Miro board. And then Celestina, are you going to share screen? Great.
I'll share as well. Oh, I might be, oh, there it is. Okay, sometimes I get black screen syndrome. So it looks like we're live. And
Yes.
of course, if you prefer to pull it up on your own, please feel free to. So I'll just orient to the board for a moment and then dig in a little bit more. So we've got some instructions that I'll get into in a moment. But really the heart of it is that we've got those 7 categories that I highlighted on a slide a little bit ago that are currently in the HPS menu of actions. And a decent chunk, potentially all of the actions that we logged at least and heard from hearing from our 2024 work that might be worth developing to adoption readiness or that had some energy behind them or were put forward. So those are in green, and then we've got quite a few orange sticky notes available to encourage you all to add notes for any actions that you don't see here. It would be helpful to use these orange notes that are in these banks here for any new notes so that we can kind of easily track as we're compiling everything what we already had noted and what new ideas were brought to the table. And then we also, to your question, Michael, about maybe interacting with these ideas in a way. For the time being, we have a thumbs up to emphasize ones you do like. So maybe not getting deep in the weeds in terms of things that you don't like, but maybe at least starting with the things that you do like. So we have a big bank of thumbs ups for that. And then, ultimately we do want to have discussion on these. So I do think, if there are trade-offs that you see between some actions, we're not quite getting down to the nitty-gritty on any of these, but just in addition to Deb's point that we are brainstorming and at the same time, anything that, is meaningful to you to comment on what's on the table here, I think could be helpful as well, because we will be trying to advance this and take the conversation we have today and really think about which actions to consider developing. So that's the activity. And then you'll see at the top here some instructions to help orient you. We've copy and pasted the definitions that Thea mentioned, one that's already adopted in Oregon Administrative Rules, and then this working definition to help us orient to adoption readiness of actions. And then we've also got our policy objectives just at that high level reiterated here. And the lenses through which we're hoping to meet those policy objectives that Thea also mentioned are listed. So those are here to revisit as you're looking through the actions list and adding to it, specifically because, there are many ways we could think about actions that local governments are taking, but prioritizing the policy objectives that we have for this work is the orientation for this evaluation of what actions might have the greatest impact for cities to meet these policy objectives. So those are there for reference. And then some kind of basic instructions, reiterating a lot of what I just said are also up here if you're more visual or want to recap. So green sticky notes are things we've already heard. Thumbs up for emphasis, review of the policy objectives if you need on the left, and orange sticky notes available for new ideas. How's that sounding for everybody?
Maybe just, I think most of you have probably used Miro board, but in case you haven't, let me just give you a couple of little tips, and others may have tips as well. On the very far left, there's a string of menu items. The one that looks like an arrow pointer is the one you want to click on to grab a Post-it note and drag it around the board. And then you can click on that Post-it note and type in. It's also the one you'll use to drag a thumbs up and across the board. You can zoom in on the bottom right. There's a little plus minus with a % sign. That's sort of your zoom feature. Sometimes I get lost in Miro boards because there's a lot of white space that isn't taken up. And I usually just go back to like zooming out as much as possible so I can find where I'm supposed to zoom in and then centering that. So one more sort of technical piece, if you are on a device that makes working a Miro board very difficult, because I know that happens, but you would like to contribute some Post-it notes, send in the chat to Celestina or Thea. I think would probably be the best. Just sort of what you'd like to add, and we can get it up there. And then also, we're going to keep this open for a few days so you can keep adding. So for those of you, one more piece that's not technical, but sort of on the what we're looking for side. These are types of actions that cities could take to achieve the policy goals that we may want to encourage them to take, and types of actions that could really help promote those, or sorry, types of things that we want to help promote. So these are actions of cities. And for those of you who are builders and on the sort of design development side, like sort of accepting the construct, think about what sort of barriers you're seeing to housing production and some of these other housing production affordability and choice. And think about what you wish cities would have in their toolkit, and that might be a good answer for things to add. So I'm gonna, well, let me just see, any just general questions about the brainstorming activity, how to use a Miro board, anything like that? Yes, Mary Kyle.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to find too many hands.
That's
I can't
fine.
figure out how to do the thumbs up feature. Can you said that and I can't remember. I don't know what you said because I had to
just
sign in again. Just a thumbs up. How do I do that?
On the Miro board or in
Miro board?
On the Miro
I know
board.
how to do it in Zoom.
Okay, just checking.
Yeah.
At the very top, there's the title bar that says adoption ready actions, and then under that are some instructions that have a little bunch of yellow things.
Right.
Those yellow things are thumbs. They're just kind of stacked up. So just grab and use the arrow.
Perfect.
Yes. Okay, you got it. Great.
Thank you.
So I'm going to give you all maybe 5-ish minutes to just kind of play around, read what's in there, add as you like, and then we're going to come back and we'll have we can verbalize the things you put on there, or you can explain it more and get some other ideas to go on there and have some discussion. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to hang out with Miro board for a while. And if you're struggling to use it, just chat one of us and we'll help you. Just checking in. Does everyone need a little more time? All right, I'm going to bring us back into the room. We can continue using and looking at the Miro board, but I'd like to encourage maybe some idea sharing and some discussion. And then, of course, you can also give us things that you haven't been able to add or new ideas that come up through discussion. So question on the table, as you all, thank you all for participating so robustly. This is super helpful to see where your heads are and to see some new ideas being put on the table here. But the primary question today is what actions could have the greatest impact for cities to meet the HOG policy objectives that are listed there, the promoting inclusive zoning, producing and retrofitting houses in high opportunity areas, streamlining housing development processes, and increasing community capacity and resilience. What could help cities really meet those policy objectives by thinking about housing production, affordability, and choice, affirmatively furthering fair housing, DLCD's racial equity framework for decision-making that Thea recapped at the beginning, and then local implementation feasibility sort of statewide. I mean, it doesn't have to work for every single city, but it needs to work for a good number of cities, an idea that could be workable for a number of cities or applicable. So let's chat. I'd be happy if you want to raise your hand and highlight something that you've added or a thought that you have specifically in here. I'd also invite the project team to interject if you have questions about things you've seen on the board or kind of want to dig into anything in particular. I highly recommend that. So, all right, who's going to rip the Band-Aid off for us to get us back in the room here? Thank you, Cassidy, brave soul. Hi, welcome. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, let's see if I can do this. Hi.
Hi, great.
I just wanted to highlight that I added streamline permitting, which I saw on the HPS list,
Yep.
in addition to expedited permitting. Because when I looked at them in the HPS, I saw that expedited was speaking of policies that might expedite permitting, say for projects that have affordable components, like, the city of Bend does that. But I wanted to make sure we were all keeping our heads around that production of all housing helps affordability and availability of all housing. And so I wanted to just pose to the group a way of thinking that we don't limit anything we try to create for cities to implement to only be applicable to affordable housing, because I don't know that that necessarily serves our broader purpose. I think we want to incentivize all housing to increase lower affordability statewide.
Great. Thank you, Cassidy, and thanks for making the distinction that you're and you're thinking on the distinction between streamlining and expediting. So appreciate that. Mac, hi.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to second that comment a little bit about expedition and streamlining. Streamlining can benefit all projects, but affordable housing projects have a certain sensitivity around time and certainty about that. And so seeing that would be good. One of the items that I want to highlight that I have included on here and kind of just expand upon a little bit was the opportunity for affordable housing developments to opt for a minimum bedroom density instead of a minimum unit density. And I bring that up in particular as just like an opportunity to hopefully realize in a no-cost way to a jurisdiction to have an opportunity for more flexibility to see larger family-sized units. An example of a project that I've worked on, we were awarded it, we got started a few weeks in, but we were getting upzoned, and the original unit mix of the building went from being majority family-sized bedrooms, and then once we had to add in an additional floor, the unit mix had to change, and the percentage of family-sized units dropped. But if we had a minimum bedroom density, we could have greater flexibility on a project site to, instead of having a bunch of studios in ones, to instead group those in larger family-sized 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units. As well within that, I know that there could be a planning concern of, well, unit density is a goal to make sure that there's a certain population kind of on site. Affordable housing developments, 95% of which at least use the LIHTC program. And the LIHTC program comes with its own occupancy requirements to make sure that a low-income person of a household of 1 can't get a 3-bedroom unit. So it kind of guarantees that there's going to be a number of folks in that building, whereas like I could get a denser site with fewer units with larger bedrooms than it may be a building that is all studios or 1-bedrooms, for example, and be able to respond to the dearth of family-sized housing that we have in the state, particularly in multifamily developments. And so I just kind of wanted to highlight that one a little bit there. Thank you.
Thanks, Mac. And I think in the context of an adoption-ready action for a city, I'm going to take a stab and other people can chime in what they think. That might look like some policy language or a process that cities can, or sort of a structure cities can take to implement or to transition from density by land to density, or density by unit to density by bedroom.
Yeah, and having it as an option as well, just to make sure, like some sites it will make more sense to have a smaller unit mix like that, but others it might not. And so that's just that. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Kathleen, are you there? And thank you for your patience.
Yes, I'm here. And unfortunately, I am not able to deal with the Miro board. So I'm going from a list that was housing, the brainstorming actions that was the attachment. So the ones that I think are most critical are partnerships with developers who are building affordable housing and equity building and reparations-based home ownership opportunities. So I'd like to highlight that. And the other thing is, I think the idea of permitting by right all housing types might be the best way to be able to include group homes, multi-purpose group homes, heavily for people with mental illness, but we're having incredible siting problems. And rather than having to litigate site by site. It'd be much better if they would be included by right in different areas and cities. I don't know if that's clear, but
thank you. Any questions from the staff team? And I'm hoping someone grabbed the sort of thumbs up that Kathy gave. Thank you. I'm seeing a nodding head there. Any questions about her ideas? Okay.
I don't think so. I think I can add it to the board for you, Kathleen.
Great.
Kathy.
And Sean, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, and this might be one of those areas too where so state law has protections for residential homes and facilities that are already part of state law. Sometimes it could be a challenge though for implementation on the ground, and so that's something that might be considered as like, hey, if we're making this model code for these different housing types, already by law it needs to be kind of agnostic in relationship to whether it's a group home or whether it's a you can't regulate the familial status of folks who live in the unit. You have to allow residential homes and facilities without imposing additional requirements. So it could be an opportunity for kind of alignment with that statute. So yeah, just to put a note on that point. I think it's something that could definitely be incorporated.
yeah, I don't care how it gets incorporated. I just need some support because every time there's a group home proposed, even if it's allowed under law, there's neighborhood resistance that is difficult to overcome.
Right. Totally understand.
Thank you. Thank you both. Alexandra.
Mine actually kind of piggybacks off Sean and Kathleen's discussion. I know that this is something that, the league and a number of our cities are tracking, and I do think there are also some fair housing concerns in terms of how that ties into our state and federal fair housing laws. We'll put the federal government aside today and just talk about the state, but it is something that we're tracking and are cognizant of. There may need to be some more conversation there.
Great, thank you. Putting a little flag for more discussion. Anyone else? I've seen some really interesting, it looks like there's a lot of ideas under the other category. I'd be curious to hear about any of those that folks want to expand on. And Sean or others who have added some, Sean, I don't think you added any, but under that zoning category, Sean, if you're seeing some that look like, oh yeah, we're already thinking about with model code, it'd be nice to hear that, or otherwise, it doesn't mean that they couldn't be outside the model code that you're working on as well. So yeah, anything is, Alexandra, is your hand still up or did you have more? Okay, great, no problem. Matt, hi.
Yeah, I had trouble seeing if this was already on the JAM board or not, but one idea that I wanted to put up there is the idea that local jurisdictions can request exceptions to the state building code. So as they're defining local need, they may identify a local need for a building code standard that's not available under the state code. And the Oregon Revised Statute permits them to request exceptions from the state building code. And that could be an action-ready plan that once they've defined a need that the state building code cannot meet, that an action would be to request an exception to actually implement that action and code and enforce that code.
Okay, great. And did you put that up there as well? Sorry, I missed that part.
Yeah, it's down there on the other section. It's on the bottom
great.
right.
I just want to make sure we got it. We'll capture it through notes too. Thank you. Hi, Garland. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. I put a link on the Miro board to a very interesting article that has put into print for the first time in my lifetime I've ever seen these words in a print publication, abolish rent. But in the wake of the LA fires, there's a growing movement of the tenants union, both in Los Angeles and nationally, that's picking up this flag and saying abolish rent, rent is theft. And I've heard from colleagues in San Jose that, yes, this is actually a theme. People are talking about this. It's very much related to the theme of housing as a human right. And the reason I bring it up is because obviously this theme is an existential threat to the rental housing industry. And so I want to raise that we do have a solution to this threat, and that's cooperative housing. That if you give renters the pathway to own their own housing, then you basically, you stop doing something that folks who look at the world through that lens would say is rent as theft. And so I'm putting that out there just because, I think when something like this comes up, a social movement, if we don't have a good response to it, it can become very dangerous. And, as we're seeking to increase housing production, this is something that could be a threat to housing production if we don't have a way to respond to it that's productive and allows people to opt in to a path forward.
Great, thank you. Thanks for keeping the big picture in mind too. It's an important one. Others have thoughts about other things we might want to be encouraging? I mean, all of these are things we might want to be encouraging cities to take on, but things that would be especially helpful to have as adoption-ready actions, making it that much easier. Yeah, Brianne, hi. And I heard your camera isn't working well today, but
can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I apologize. My camera, I got a computer upgrade yesterday and it downgraded it apparently. So I guess the only thing, and I didn't put this on the board, but happy to expand on it, is just ties to trying to better tie housing in CFAs and consistency with CFEC and the key destinations in CFEC, because that's where we're going to be trying to put a lot of our resources in cities for infrastructure, to really try and make that nexus a little bit stronger. And I guess along with that, I would just really, really caution, which we can talk more about this later, but relying too heavily on the high opportunity area definition from OHCS. I think there's a lot of limitations with that definition. We've already kind of started to explore those early on as a city. And I just think you're missing a lot of maybe true high opportunity, what should be included in the high opportunity, or just mapping issues with what defines a grocery store, and a lot of limitations. It's not really taking into consideration major like pedestrian barriers and bike barriers and all these things. So I would just caution, don't rely too heavily on that. And I would personally, or as a city, I think we would want to see that if we are going to have them more geo-based, really trying to tie that more to CFEC and CFAs.
Thank you so much, Brianne. And I'm going to put our DLCD staff on the on call to demystify some of the acronyms that some of us are familiar with and others forget what it all means. So if someone could speak to CFEC and CFA, that would be really helpful to make sure we all are on the same page. Who's going to do it?
Sure, yes. Those terms come from our transportation planning requirements and transportation planning rules. So CFEC is climate friendly and equitable communities, and CFA is a climate friendly area. And so those rules were adopted relatively recently in the last couple of years, and include requirements about transportation planning, and also have some requirements around housing capacity planning in those climate-friendly areas. So there are some nexus points that we've been working on integrating, and right now the locational considerations in the Oregon administrative rules that were adopted last year for kind of how we're orienting this programming does specifically reference the key destinations that Brianne just mentioned that are listed in the climate friendly and equitable communities, the CFEC rules, as we say for short, but really they're just part of our transportation planning rules. And that question about defining high opportunity areas is definitely one that we will be continuing to pursue. And Brianne, I just wanted to clarify, was that something that you're able to add to the board? I guess I'm trying to track if things are or are not there, so that we can, as best we can, have a cohesive picture of what y'all are bringing to the table.
I will add it to the board. I wasn't sure if we were supposed to add comments about ones that were already there or just new ideas. I didn't want to start criticizing or adding, tearing apart anything yet. So
I see you were playing off of an existing idea in there. Yes, gotcha. And I think also, Brianne, while you're there, I think what I heard from your comment is that OHCS's definition of high opportunity and meeting, at least in the city of Bend, meeting the needs under CFEC maybe are posing some challenges, bringing those two in alignment, or understanding how they mesh. Is that part of what you were saying?
Correct. I guess we've just done some initial look at it, and one, there's challenges with even just mapping those those high opportunity areas as they're defined, and then two, just inconsistency. I guess would that potentially eliminate large areas of the city that we do want to encourage housing, including climate friendly areas? So I just want to make sure it shouldn't be an either or, maybe it's both, or really a lot of attention needs to be paid to the definition of high opportunity areas, I think, for it to be successful and just to be implementable.
That's helpful. Thank you. And I know something the team is thinking about, so perfectly aligned. Other comments? I saw a comment in here that I'm intrigued by that has a few thumbs up, and it's a new idea, which is standardized orientation. I'm just picking randomly, by the way. Standardized orientation for newly elected city and county officials to orient to ONA, adoption-ready actions, etc. I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that. Yeah, Shannon, please. Thanks.
Sure, thanks. I suggested that idea. I'm just thinking about how do we start something and then continue it right through time. And there is a body of work always in orienting, new people who come on board to a role. And it would be great if not every city had to recreate that wheel, right? If that's something that seems like perhaps the HAPO office, for example, might be able to develop an orienting and onboarding toolkit.
And maybe with the hopes of making them more comfortable with some of those actions, or at least just more comfortable with the program.
Or even excited, right? What if knowing that you get to do this becomes an incentive for running for local public office, for example.
Great, thank you. Looks like others agree that it's a good idea as well. And I should have mentioned at the top, there are no promises to what we'll be working up the next few months, but all of these potential actions are being, as you can see, documented and tracked. There's a limited number we'll be working on this year to really get at those policy objectives, but it doesn't mean that they won't continue to be built over time. And we're also the consultant team is also doing some research on effectiveness in other places that have tried some of these things to make sure time is being spent in an area that has impact. Michael.
This is an issue that relates to several of these in the zoning corner. Looking through multifamily zoning codes in various cities around the state, it's just over and over again, I come across the reality that it's very hard to build a 45-unit building in most apartment zones, even the apartment zones, right? And because there's always some weak link. And so the importance of getting a really solid multifamily model code it will be so useful in so many ways if that can be applied to a bunch of these items. That's all.
Yeah, and I'll just throw out, sorry, I'm hearing myself on the microphone.
You're good.
Sorry, I have two.
Oh yeah, you have two devices going. Yeah.
Two devices. Yeah, so just to that point, the model code does have a multi-unit component of that. And so I think part of that is exploring for these three different city sizes, what are kind of appropriate design and development standards governing the development of each, kind of recognizing that for smaller cities or for larger cities, we should kind of be shooting for best practice. That's one of the intended purposes of the model code. But then for smaller cities, we should think about also implementability too, what would be useful for a small city that's, maybe not subject to the owner requirement, that type of thing. So there'll be kind of that conversation and weighing that we'll get into as we get talking about the model code. And we'll flag that for a discussion in particular in February.
Thanks, Sean. Yes, there'll be more on that, and that'll be another helpful touch point to see where we are on that. Garland.
I put two notes up there that kind of get at the fact that there's a push and a pull in the marketplace, and that regardless of what cities do in terms of zoning, there's still the private marketplace, and what incentives are there for the private marketplace to move? And so those two, the first is putting something like, say, start at $1 a day per surface parking lot, a tax on surface parking lot spaces to incentivize the moving of that land use, surface parking lots, from essentially what's an urban land bank function to, get off the couch and redevelop that. There's so many surface parking lots in the Rose Quarter of Portland, even in downtown Portland, that we've been waiting for generations for the landowners to pull the trigger and finally turn that into housing, and it's just never happening. Well, maybe we could do something to incentivize the private market to add some cost to essentially market speculation of waiting for a higher price in the future. Let's impose some costs on that waiting so that maybe that time will come sooner when they'll choose to redevelop. And of course, the economist's favorite is the land value tax would be perhaps another way to approach that. So that's also up there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Good to get some innovative ideas on the table. Oh, thumbs up. Kathy, go ahead.
I was thinking the same thing that was Garland just talked about, the notion of switching our property tax system to a land value tax as a way to incentivize the rapid attainment of the highest and best use on each parcel rather than rewarding property speculation or inaction as the current system does. I'd like to hear some discussion about the pros and cons of that approach if we could.
Okay. That's a big one, but we should be putting big ideas on the table. This is a full brainstorming. I should have mentioned also at the top the idea that Julia had, which was to make sure we're identifying actions that maybe are better suited for when a city is in the acceleration or accountability program versus when a city is in the sort of upfront planning actions program. So I'd open the floor for that as well. But Celestina, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to orient a little bit to the frame of mind of what things we can do or what things local governments can do, and then some limitations on that. And so one of the ways that we tried to capture that in the memo, of actions from 2024 was to have a section on things that local governments could advocate for at the state level. And so, it's possible that one of the adoption ready actions is some sort of advocacy suite. We haven't quite gotten down far enough on that item to really conceptualize exactly what it would be. But for example, changing property tax reform would be a legislative endeavor and not something that a local government could opt into. So there are, a handful of ideas out there that I know feel promising in a lot of ways to reach our housing goals, but wouldn't be within the domain of a local government.
Thank you. Other ideas that anyone wants to highlight? Any questions from project team members about anything you're seeing? Is there anything on here so far that you're not quite sure what it says? Mac.
Hi, sorry. One of the things that I kind of just put on there that I think could be interesting is also, so we're talking a lot about making sure that sites, or some of the discussion is about making sites denser, but I think on the counter side, we should also think about making sure that sites that had density do not lose it upon redevelopment. And so the city of Chicago, for example, at one point put an ordinance in place, particularly for gentrifying areas, that you couldn't take, let's say, a home that was internally divided into a duplex or a triplex or whatever, and then convert it back to a single family home. And I think that's something that we should also be thinking out at the state. There could be, of course, an exemption, like say one of the units in the building is below the standards of what OHCS says is a minimum unit size. I think there could be flexibility there, or like if it's an undue financial burden to the owner or something like that. But just wanting to make sure that we're not net losing density on some sites as a smaller home or small duplex is maybe renovated into a larger single family home. Yeah, just wanting to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thanks. And that could be the kind of adoption ready action if we move forward with that. That'd be like some policy language that a city might be able to use and sort of ideas about how they could apply that. Thea.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. I was interested to just throw out a question that I have, for the cities who are and the jurisdictions who are in this call, but also for any of you who have worked in the area about what actions or types of actions you think might be particularly useful. We're really trying to drill down, we have this whole world of actions that we could focus on. And there's a lot of ways that we're going to think about how to narrow in. But one of the ones that I want to highlight and would love to hear some ideas about is, what is most impactful, what for a local community, what would be the most useful, truly.
Brianne.
I'm happy to share a little bit. I think one of the ideas already been put up there, but it's been successful in Bend is affordable housing requirements in UGB expansion areas, as well as unit minimums and mix minimums in our expansion areas. And what we're seeing, while they do take a long time to develop, but most of them are master planned at this point or partially developed, is that we are getting even above those minimums, and they're well beyond kind of what our targets were and what we were seeing in development that didn't otherwise have that regulation. So I think that had been very successful. And then what I think would be very potentially helpful is to look at some actions about standalone residential in our commercial zones. We have a lot of infill potential. We have a lot of underutilized commercial, not everywhere, but a lot of strip commercial and underutilized commercial. And we have done so much to remove barriers, and we still aren't really seeing infill. So I don't know what that looks like, but I think standalone residential and commercial could be promising.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for bringing your experience forward too. Julia, go ahead.
I don't have a response to the question, but I also am just curious to kind of invert the question, potentially for developers and architects in this space of what have been the biggest hiccups or challenges that you face in terms of getting projects either to pencil or be approved through the permitting process as well. Because I think there's just as much to learn, kind of what are the things we could fix across the board too.
Yep. And that seems to be a problem in a lot of places. I mean, I think we've heard some of them, but you're right. Cassidy.
Hi, Julie, I like your question, but I'm not going to answer it, even though I'm a housing developer. So I can maybe think about that because it's sort of everything. It's sort of in trying to get a project going these days, it's sort of death by 1,000 cuts and the variety of things that can prevent you from getting all the little pieces to align. But I wanted to just sort of offer to the group a way of thinking, because the question about sort of generally what things can be helpful. And I think we're talking about a lot of things in some of what we're saying here that are ways we want to see how what gets made be better in all the ways that these goals outline, which I think probably we have a lot of agreement on that. But I want to make sure that in crafting rules, we're making sure that we're also thinking about, well, how do we make sure that something actually happens? Because if we just add layers and regulations and rules about if something were to happen, I want it to be like X, but we can never find a way to push forward and incentivize X to happen, it doesn't really matter what rules we make around it. And I think that's a little bit, unfortunately, the conundrum we're in as a state with the way we've been approaching statewide zoning regulations for a long time. And I think we're all learning that lesson as we live through time together with the innovations that we made back in the 70s that we're trying to work through here. So I just wanted to kind of, at a higher level, make sure we're thinking about that and that we truly find ways to give cities and producers, both affordable and market, the carrots that they need to make things go.
Thank you. Seeing some head nodding, and definitely fits in that realm of one, balancing sort of flexibility and certainty, and also balancing this need for making sure we're not just loading on expectations without also bringing resources to offset some of those expectations, or resources to really promote those things. Celestina, do you have something to chime in about on that real quick?
Yeah, just another kind of framing point, because I think you're right on, Cassidy, that one of the ways that we've been also trying to start to parse out different types of actions and incentives is to think about the incentives as potentially applying to any specific goal that we need, because a lot of and eventually then like matching them up, right? So we know that we need to incentivize accessible housing. We know we need to incentivize affordable housing. There are arguments to be made about incentivizing all housing. And so we have a bundle of incentives and then a bundle of things we're trying to accomplish. And so starting to match which incentives where, model codes is one place to go. But thinking of it that way can sometimes help to drill down a little bit more.
Thanks. Shannon.
Thank you. First, I'm so grateful for today's conversation. I love this Miro board. It's so exciting to be here with these thoughtful, creative humans working together to make things better, right? That's my frame. That's how I'm showing up. There's something that worries me a little bit sometimes when we focus on expediting permits and expediting things that are unduly slow. Having them be faster is great. And I feel like personally, what I think I see is that part of the pressure to speed things up is the high cost of capital right now. Construction interest rates are just high. I just want to name that, right? So for for-profit builders, interest rates are high. For nonprofit builders, interest rates are high. And I think that's part of what's emphasizing speed right now. And I think when I think about how do we fix this supply issue long term, maybe so unpopular, but I'm going to say it. I think it's to have a pipeline that is consistent and predictable, and a pipeline that's bigger. There are always some times of year that are going to be less good to pour a foundation, no matter how fast permits are, right? It's just going to be. And so, of course, let's expedite the things that are needlessly, ridiculously slow, and those are good strategies. And how do we continually expand this pipeline despite inevitable changes in the market? And maybe those low interest loan funds are really, really, really important too. Thanks.
Thanks, Shannon. Helpful perspective to keep in mind here too. Samuel.
Yeah, I've been getting questions, especially from smaller jurisdictions who really want to include an AFFH policy in their housing production strategy, but don't really have a lot of examples to go off of. The city of Boston does have a municipal AFFH policy, but it's pretty specific to their situation. It's not necessarily something that's going to work in the Oregon context. I think especially for cities that are not entitlement jurisdictions and haven't already been doing analysis of impediments to fair housing choice or have any experience with that, it would be helpful to get kind of model version from DLCD that just has the basics of here's the information that you need to collect and how to present it and here's how you could operationalize it. I think that would be really helpful.
Great. Thank you, Samuel. And I'm seeing some head nods as well. It's helpful. Garland?
Yeah, I've got three thoughts and they're related. The first is that to the extent that that cities are the problem in terms of taking a long time to review and issue permits, California did this thing for ADUs where they said basically you have to issue your permit in 60 days. Otherwise it's deemed approved. And I would even take that one step farther, and I would say, well, why not make that requirement for all building types? Your permits are in hand in 60 days or 50% of your money back. Why not give this is something that developers have been complaining about for decades. The cities don't have any skin in the game. Why don't you give the city some skin in the game? You want the money from those permits, issue them in a timely fashion. Otherwise, you lose out on some of them, and maybe they're deemed approved. That's something that I know if you work for a city, it would strike fear into your heart to hear that. But if you are truly seeking to incentivize housing production, that's something that could be on the table. But then, related to that is also, to the extent that our zoning codes are holding back development, we know that the market doesn't build on 100% of the sites that we identify as opportunity sites. And yet we think that we can check the box and go home if we have planned for our zoned capacity to equal market demand. That's not the way the market works. So maybe we should have a rule that says that cities and counties should plan for something like 5 times estimated market demand as their zone capacity, so that you've got more of a roll of the dice each time, that only 20% of the opportunity sites need to go and develop within your planning horizon in order for you to meet your capacity. Let's plan to succeed rather than essentially plan to fail by not zoning for sufficient capacity for market movers to move or not move, as the case may be within any particular planning horizon.
Great, thank you. Some other big ideas to ponder. Alexandra, and then after you, I have a new question for you all to weigh in on, but go ahead.
Mine's less of a question or a thing on the board. I think it's more of a comment. I think as we're discussing permitting and kind of concerns around, permitting timelines from cities, I really want to emphasize, for most of our cities, permitting timelines are largely based on kind of staffing capacity and limited staffing capacity that are, it's very much dictated by the limited revenue tools that cities have. So when we're talking about permitting timelines, heard fully, and developers or housing developers are not the only folks that we hear this from. But permits have a place and a reason, and we would love to be able to get them all done in a certain amount of time, but there is capacity and funding and all of those things that play a huge role in that conversation. So more than happy to have a conversation about it, but it is a whole conversation about kind of what does it look like to properly and appropriately fund our permitting departments, and how do we support getting there rather than saying you have to do it in 60 days or else.
Yep, thank you. It's a tangled knot, and I see you've inspired some additional thoughts, so let's go to those. Go ahead, Mac.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. That prompt and sort of the discussion about permitting. So one of the things that I also want to highlight back to Julia's previous question about things that have been a barrier within getting a site through land use and permitting and to approval, so you can finally have those permits in hand. An experience we have been having more recently is that land use has not necessarily really been the issue. The problem has been engineering and the interpretation that engineering departments are able to have to kind of drag out a project's review timeline. And so I'm not saying or proposing any things today of how you fix that. That's a really wicked problem. But I just kind of want to name that, as well as in terms of thinking about local capacity. Yeah, a lot of jurisdictions, of course, are in a limited sort of capacity. And I recognize what I'm about to say is kind of outside the context of what ONA is able to do. But I am thinking a lot about, it would be great if the state instead had a system. This came out of the Housing Production Advisory Council recommendations, but like a pre-vetted list of third-party permit review staff that are on deck, verified, that a jurisdiction could go to if after a certain amount of time your average permit issuance time is above a certain threshold, and then you'd have to would be encouraged to use those third parties until you dropped it below that certain threshold for a certain amount of time. And recognizing that some jurisdictions just don't have staff and a lot of financial capacity, like if the state had a program to provide those low staffed jurisdictions through no fault of their own, compensation to engage with those permitting services, I think is something that could be sort of solving that sort of issue to make sure that we do get to keep permits at a predictable timeline. We're not punishing jurisdictions for things and workforce challenges out of their control, but still getting the needed housing on the ground. Yeah, so I'll just leave you all with that.
All right, a new type of technical assistance resource, and I'm seeing some potential, interesting idea. I'm seeing some nodding heads, some quizzical, like, well, maybe that could be interesting. I'm going to call on Anne because we haven't heard from her yet, and then Brianne, I'll get to you next.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a city person here, and I really appreciate what Alexander just said, and also Mac. It's so hard to get staff positions filled, even if we have budget. We're in a time where it's really hard to fill positions. You have to keep that in mind. But what I was going to say was more of a bigger picture thing with the housing, and we're just talking about the ONA, and we've talked about CFA and CFAC, but we have to keep all of the other facility plans and needs in mind. It isn't all housing. It's got to be a jobs housing balance. We're looking at we have big issues with updating our facility plans is costly, and we can only do them every 5 to 8 years or 8 to 10 years or whatever. So when we're really looking at these population projections that are coming out from the state, and then also looking at history to plan for those, and then we have a big influx. It really does affect facility planning. I just want to keep that in mind. It's challenging, but what I was going to really say is, in the climate friendly areas, we want a jobs housing balance, and we're struggling with, and Brianne sort of touched on this, we want standalone residential in our climate friendly areas, but we have some of our mixed use zones that have just been completely taken up with housing where we kind of wanted, some walkability. So we're trying to straddle that, having enough services and housing in an area that we're really trying to get people off the cars. So we have, as a city, we have multiple issues that we're trying to achieve all of the things, and I appreciate you guys being really thoughtful about how to navigate that, and all the really good ideas. And I'll take some time to look at the mirror board. It's just kind of a lot of really good ideas. So thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Appreciate that perspective. Brianne.
Just a few comments. As far as permitting timelines go, I would just say that they are highly, highly dependent on the quality of a submittal, and the city's ability to turn around. So I think just assuming that something would just be approved. I have literally seen things hand drawn, not to scale, just on a piece of paper. So I would not want that to just be approved in 60 days. So quality of submittal is a huge part of a city's ability to turn around. Oftentimes we see developers just trying to get something in so that it gets in the queue and it's not even close to complete. So I just want to caution that. And then I completely agree with Garland in that market capacity is very different than paper capacity. And we really ought to think hard about the ability to truly, what we can expect from a market capacity standpoint. We did a market study, and it was, I wouldn't say jarring, but it was under very rosy conditions and still was anticipated to produce much lower than what we would have hoped. And then would just agree with Anne that, as a city, we do struggle with the, do you allow standalone residential? But then we've also seen the super siting of affordable housing in commercial areas overtake, especially in neighborhood commercial, where it's, it's a very small area of commercial. And then if it's supersided with housing, we had to work for a decade, 2 decades to get that to be a commercial node that we were hoping to really serve a highly, highly residential area so that we could truly have walkability, and then you just see it disappear. So really thinking carefully about what those trade-offs might be and where it might be appropriate to use it and where it might not be appropriate to use some of those tools.
Thank you. That's helpful. I see, and Lorelei, I think you have an additional thought. I see a couple hands up. I'm happy to take it. I'm also wanting to, I think we've got what we need, at least for the activity we have at hand on expediting permitting. So if there are some other things, I'd like to hear about that. And I just want to plant from you, or for you to be thinking about also before we wrap up this conversation. Of the things that are on the Miro board, things you've heard today, I think it'd be helpful for us to do sort of a check-in with ourselves and one another on which of the actions maybe seem like they might be least effective at a statewide scale or least effective for cities to take action on. I'm not saying they don't belong on a list of actions, but do they belong on the list of like, these are really good ideas that are going to be effective at getting us toward housing production, affordability, or choice? I wouldn't frame it like this, but I think, Michael, if you had something that you quote unquote didn't like, that might be the time to say it, or that you think just might not be the right path to go down. Kathleen, before I take you, I'm going to let Lorelei just sort of jump in, see if you have some thoughts or questions.
Well, Deb, I was going to take us in a slightly different direction,
I'm
so
sorry.
I'll put it
Please.
out there and then you can redirect if it's a bad idea. So I'm really loving watching all of this stuff pop up on the Miro board, and there's a million really good ideas in here that I think will be helpful additions to the pile of HPS actions that cities can select from. And I'm reflecting on the working definition of adoption-ready actions that the DLCD team has put out there, that they are immediately actionable, they're fully developed, you can pull them off the shelf and implement them locally. Not all of these actions kind of meet that definition, or are possible to turn into something that any generic city could just pull off of the shelf and then run with and use. So I'm wondering if there are any of these actions that you're seeing as being particularly appropriate to develop into an adoption-ready action as a resource to be available to you all, as distinct from which are just good things to keep development moving. We need to find the overlap in Venn diagram between really good to keep development moving and something that we can develop into an adoption-ready action. So Deb, that's a different question than the one that you posed. You choose where you want us to go from here.
That's all good. I'll put one more idea on the table, which is also, as we look at these and we've been thinking about it, one of the areas that we could use some additional help with or identifying the actions that are most promising to have impact in serving those who are often not well served by housing, especially low-income communities, communities of color, tribal communities, people with disabilities. We have quite a few actions that have been brought up in the past and are on the board today around how to get more accessible features and accessible units. And we have some in there about preference. I saw one about preference policy. There might be some others, but if you have other ideas about most promising to have the greatest impact, to sort of Lorelei's point, what is going to have the greatest impact? And we're not losing all the rest. We're just trying to think about the ones that would most benefit to work up. Okay, Kathy, you've been very patient. Thank you.
So I think I have just an overall question on something I really don't understand. I mean, I've been involved in this process now for almost 2 years, but I still drive down Sandy Boulevard or go downtown, and every other property, if not more, are vacant. And I don't know how to incentivize using those properties. It doesn't seem to be a zoning issue, but I'm not sure what it is and how we affect it, because there are just so many places that are already built or could be demolished and used as sites, and that's not happening. I just don't understand. And I'm sorry if that's not going in the narrowing direction, but that's really where I'm stuck.
Oh, I think you've narrowed it to say you'd like more time spent on looking at actions that could help with those vacant properties infill challenges, and what more could be done to help cities incentivize those. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Alexandra.
We'll just plug land value taxes there, or vacancy taxes, things like that. Kind of going back to Deb, your question, and also kind of the junction with Lorelei's question of like, when we're looking at this from a city perspective and like, okay, what are these are affordable, like, or not affordable, adoption ready actions, things that start with the letter A. We're in the middle of the afternoon, I could use an extra coffee. But I think there are some things, certainly that fall kind of within the city sphere. And I'm also noticing some things on this list, like, let's see here, agency coordination on eligibility. I think that certainly makes the city adoption of actions easier, but perhaps falls back to kind of our partners and friends at DLCD and OHCS to do some of the work in partnership with us. And then, you know, land value tax and vacancy tax kind of conversation, you know, certainly cities are looking at revenue reform. You know, revenue is kind of one of our biggest conversations. Because we are so constrained on that front, but that's likely something that has to go to the legislature and is not something that we kind of as cities can necessarily, like, we may advocate for it in the legislature, but it's not something that we can kind of independently take action on. And so I think, you know, as we're looking through this list, there has to be, you know, I will volunteer my city folks and myself to chime in of like, okay, there are some things on this list that we can do. This is within our kind of scope and capacity, and some things that fall, you know, fairly significantly to moderately outside of what we can and can't do. And some things that are partnerships between everyone in this room. So.
Thank you. That's helpful, Alexandra, and helpful for you to point out a little bit on both sides of that equation as examples. We appreciate that. Ariel, hi.
Hi, I don't know that I'll necessarily help with this sort of limiting scope, but something that came up sort of when we were talking about reframing and sort of prioritizing, and that Venn diagram that sort of Lorelei was mentioning is just, I would want to advocate for when we come to the slimming down or the elevating ideas up, that it's not just net impact for housing production for the adoption ready actions. I think there's also an element of like some jurisdictions are struggling with figuring out how to create certain types of policies. And so maybe where there's also just a need, not necessarily low hanging fruit in those adoption ready actions. If there's areas that DLCD has like heard or observed a lot of nexus for challenges that cities are facing that are not necessarily high production actions, that there might still be some value in elevating those up into adoption ready actions.
Are you thinking maybe some of those actions fall in the category of actions that may need to be taken to affirmatively further fair housing or housing choice? Maybe it's not maximizing a whole bunch more production, but
yeah, definitely some of those types of actions. Yeah.
Thank you. Daisy, hi.
Hi there. Sorry I'm off camera. I'm feeling a little under the weather, but one, I really liked Ariel's point that Ariel just made, and kind of to Alexandra's comment, and this isn't helping narrow down actions either, but I just want to share it. Some of you may know that under the ONA framework, Metro regional government is mandated to develop a regional housing coordination. And so just kind of a reminder that Metro is also a partner here, and we're here to also see maybe if there are actions that would make more sense at the Metro level. But yeah, just a plug for my Portland region folks.
I appreciate that, Daisy. Thank you. And we can definitely be looking at that as well. Rachel, good to see you.
So as I'm thinking about all of this and kind of narrowing things down in the big picture and the long term, and you know, the ebbs and flows of the market, I think it's really important to create adoption ready actions that are more broad, and then maybe have some guidance outside of them for what we're experiencing now. I work in affordable housing lending, and what we're seeing right now is that it's really hard to get any loans approved. So all of the loans that that have been successful through, this upheaval of the affordable housing industry over the last couple of years, are pretty much the only ones that can get approved. We're not doing anything really super creative right now, but we were a couple of years ago. So I think it's really important to be able to be proactive with what we can in the market that we're experiencing in the moment. So having greater flexibility in the rules, but narrower guidance for the time we're in, I think is something that we should definitely keep as a priority through this, through our work.
I think that's really helpful framing. Thank you. And some indicators about when such an action would and wouldn't be most effective, it sounds like would be part of that guidance. Great. Thank you. I saw a heart from Alexandra. Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in before we take a break on actions that you think really are needed to be most effective, or for cities to be most effective in getting at housing production, affordability, and choice, or ones that you've heard about or see on the Miro board that you think, oh, this might be spending a lot of time on something that won't be getting us there. Any actions on the board that worry you? I've heard about the sort of push and pull with the expedited permitting issues. Yeah, Michael, go ahead. I see you went off mute.
Yeah, I am quite worried about the housing type mixing, like mandatory housing types in each building requirement. It's been kicked around. It doesn't seem to me that every building should have to serve every purpose.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Seeing some thumbs up and nodding heads. Okay. Brock.
Hey, sorry, I've been off for a bit
Glad
since
you're
I was
here.
in the dentist, but thank you. I can't see what's on the board because I'm listening from my phone right now, but I think I agree with what Michael said based on what I heard. That doesn't seem great. And then since I can't see on the board, I'll ask, and then if it's not already there, then I would say add it. Is there anything that's been added about expanding UGB to bring in more land? And I realize that's not, the first choice for everybody, but sometimes it is needed, and I just want to make sure that's on the list.
Good question. I don't know. I haven't been working with it as much, so I'll let others maybe take a look and let you know. And we can capture that otherwise. I mean, obviously there's a process for bringing in more land. So when you're thinking about adoption ready action, what are you thinking about in that context, Brock?
Oh, gotcha. Sorry. Let me circle back. I apologize.
Okay.
I wasn't here for the intro to the conversation. So.
Yeah, sorry. You probably missed the definition of adoption ready action. All right, very good. Sean, hand up. Maybe Sean, you have some thoughts.
Yeah, if I can just chime in really quickly. So this is just a statutory context that I think is important to mention, because it's been kind of a point that's been missed. When a city does goal 10 planning, they actually do two documents. They do a housing capacity analysis and they do a housing production strategy. The capacity analysis is based pretty much trying to answer one major question. What is the capacity of lands, and does the city need to take measures to increase the amount of land or increase the zone capacity of land? And essentially what it means is when you complete that analysis, if you have a deficit and you can't accommodate that within the UGB, you're required by law to expand your right? So kind of an acknowledgement of that and acknowledgement that's what the HCA is about. The housing production strategy is more focused on, all right, let's take that capacity question aside and let's think about the other actions that we need to do to facilitate production, right? So that's something that's, I think, maybe a little bit lost in that saying that UGB expansion is an action, because it's part of the goal 10 process. It's a statutory requirement to expand a UGB if you identify a need. So that's just something to keep in mind. So maybe think about it more in terms of well, what can we do to make that land ready? What can we do to facilitate production? That's going to be a useful conversation for us. But saying how do you expand a UGB? It's well, that's just the point of goal 10 and goal 14 planning, right? Or at least one of the points.
Yes, and I understand that to a certain extent. At the same time, looking at for example, and this is the most contentious example, so it's the one that I think people will know the best right now, but the city of North Plains, right? For a decade, they've been trying to expand their UGB because they need both residential and employment land, and they haven't been able to do so. And so for them, doing that UGB expansion is a strategy to increase production. I get what you're saying, but I do think there is room for, making sure that you are actually meeting that 20-year supply of land within your UGB. I think that is a reasonable strategy.
Right. And I think maybe what I would say is like with North Plains or other examples of cities that have been hung up, part of the underlying direction that's part of the especially the capacity and urbanization tax rule like charge is to address that type of problem, making sure that cities have a clear pathway to expand a UGB when they identify a need. So I don't want to cross it too much or spend too much time on it, but I just really want to emphasize it's like we're not ignoring it as part of this rulemaking process. It's just, is this the venue for it, or is it the cow tag that's the venue for it?
Okay, got it. That makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Okay, 4 hands up. Let's get through those and then let's take a little break, please. And again, the Miro board will stay open, and Brock, you can get in there and interact with it when you get back to out of the dentist's office orientation. So great. Garland, please go ahead.
So I want to raise a concern that I've heard other speakers raise, which is that if we are really emphasizing housing production, what does that come at the cost of? And does that come at the cost of complete communities or neighborhood grocery stores? And I want to flip that on its head and ask, how do we allow our communities to evolve over time? Once you develop a building, even much less a community, is it locked in amber, or what are the provisions for it to continue to evolve as a structure or as a neighborhood over time? And do our codes facilitate ongoing evolution, or do they prohibit ongoing evolution? And one of the things that I have in mind is just the fact of a building being residential or a lot being residential. If a property owner wants to add a retail use to a property over time, are they allowed to do so, or are they prevented from doing so? And one of the concepts I'd like to throw out there is the idea of, similar to how you can have an accessory dwelling unit to add a dwelling unit to a single family home, what if you could build an accessory commercial unit to add a retail use to any kind of building, to which that might be accessory to the primary use for which is originally constructed? That's one example, but what are other ways that we could allow for communities to evolve over time to become more complete if at first whack out of the ground, they seem to be a little bit too much of a monoculture and not contributing towards the complete communities framework? Thanks.
Thanks, Garland. I think that is the sort of balance and challenge that we're all working toward, especially, just history of those who have been locked out of housing and housing opportunities and housing choice, and making sure that the focus our eye doesn't get off that ball, and needing to make sure we're furthering housing choice as we're developing. It's not developing at all costs or producing. Mac, please go ahead.
Hey there. Sorry, I'm kind of going back to the question of things on the board that gives pause a little bit. And I think there may have been some discussion about this earlier. Sorry, with some of the stuff in the news, I've had to multitask for some of my other projects, so I apologize there. But one of the things that's on this list that I think really gives me kind of pause from a statewide perspective is inclusionary zoning. I think that it is a strategy that is useful, but it gets so complicated in specifics of locations that it would be really difficult for the state to draft something that is applicable statewide without it being potentially too blunt of an instrument and cap development overall, when we need units of all types, market and affordable. And so I just kind of wanted to make a reference to that. And if it had been said previously, kind of bring it up again in the context of this question.
Thank you. Seeing a heart and a couple of nodding heads. And it might be something we're thinking about. How else could one promote or incentivize that outside of an adoption ready action? Samuel.
I just want to follow up on one note about the adoption ready plans that meet accessibility needs. The city of Eugene really did a great has taken some really great first steps as far as their ADU library goes of pre-approved plans. By my count, of the 11 pre-approved plans in that library, 2 are explicitly built to accessible standards. And the city of Portland, I know, ported over some of those for their own version, but not the accessible ones. And I believe that Bend also used some of those plans from Eugene. I don't know, maybe the people from Bend can speak to whether or not they got those accessible plans. And I really like the pre-approved plans as a tool, but if there's not accessible options in there, I think that's a real lost opportunity.
Thank you. That's helpful. I saw a thumbs up from Brian. Brian, would you mind just expanding? Does that mean you not only have seen them, but they've been used, or?
I do not work on them directly, but it's my understanding that yes, we do have pre-approved plans for ADUs at this stage, and I think we took them from Eugene, or we borrowed them. And I know we're starting to see them used. I think it's relatively new.
But Brianne, do you know if those plans are the accessible ones? Because again, it was only 2 out of the 11 that they've approved so
I
far.
would have to follow up directly with housing
Okay.
staff on it.
Thank you.
They might have even adopted all of them. I don't know. I'd have to follow up directly with housing staff.
Thanks, Brianne. And I don't want to lose your comment either, Samuel, which is if more energy and time is being spent in that direction to really focus on units that have accessibility built in. Thank you for that. All right, I'm going to give us 1 more minute. If there's any last comments anyone wants to interject before we take a break, and then we'll come back and have a few other small items. Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
This may be quick. I noticed the item that has the most thumbs, I think, is the one that is about middle housing on high opportunity land. I assume it has the most thumbs because we're already essentially doing it. I'm not sure I understand how this is different from House Bill 2001. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm just hoping to understand that better.
I will let DLCD staff weigh in on that if someone has thoughts on that, or anyone else. Mary Kyle.
Sorry.
I'm just guessing, Michael, but high opportunity lands are not necessarily zoned residential, like surface parking lots, strip malls, etc. I hope that we see those used for not just middle housing, but even bigger than middle housing. But I'm not sure where my thumbs ended up on that Miro board, but that's just what I'm thinking is meant.
They're all over the place.
They are.
Totally get it. Sean, I'm sorry. I think I inadvertently cut you off.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was just, Michael, could you repeat yourself just so I make sure I'm understanding correctly?
I just got a text from Julia saying we suggested this item. So to be clear, I may have crossed my own wires here, but I was just reacting to the fact that there were a ton of thumbs next to the zoning. At least 25% of land that allows middle housing needs to meet the high opportunity area zone. And I was trying to figure out, like, doesn't all residential land already meet essentially within these cities?
It's the high opportunity.
Yeah.
Right. And that may not always be residentially zoned. True.
Yeah, maybe this warrants a deeper discussion about like what precise. I think we got some of that already with the conversation around like CFAs and that type of thing, but maybe that's worth a deeper dive.
Great. Thank you. And I guess I should ask while we're here, Michael, when you said earlier something that gave you pause or concern on the board, was that the one that was giving you the most pause, or were there others?
No. I'm missing it right now, but
I can circle back to you on that.
Yeah,
No
I can send you now.
That's fine. Cool. Great. Anything else before we take a break? Okay.
I'm just gonna jump in so that
Thank you, Celestina. I knew I lost track of something. Thank you. Go ahead.
No, perfect. We're at 2:58, so I think we're right on. and we might even be a little early, just to help keep our energy and time focused and meaningful for this group, just kind of draw a clear line between the fact that land use efficiency measures, which is a term that we haven't used a whole lot in this room because it's largely used in the capacity and urbanization TAC, but is fully relevant to our work here. So that means any actions that increase density or otherwise increase the efficiency of land to be usable to meet housing need. Those types of actions are absolutely part of this conversation. And those kinds of things can be developed to adoption readiness and are part of housing production strategy kind of framework. But the specific, act of expanding a UGB because land use efficiency measures, were not sufficient enough to meet housing need, that is outside of the HOG scope. That's part of the capacity and urbanization TAC and is not an HPS action. So hopefully that can help gear our conversation here and then also gear that conversation for those of you in the CalTAC.
Related but different. Yeah, and I'm sure if there are some of those things on the board, we'll probably flag them and we'll definitely be sharing them with other folks that are working on land efficiency through the CalTAC. All right, let's take a break. Why don't we give ourselves 10 minutes? 10 past. I'm gonna turn off my camera, and then if you all, when you get back, if you could turn your cameras on at 3:10, and then we'll reconvene. Thank you. Hi, Julia. I don't know if you dropped off before we went on break, but just in case, we're on break until 3:10. All right, it's 3:10. If you're there, if you could turn your camera on at least for a minute or two, I'd appreciate it, just so I can make sure I'm not all alone here. Great. I think we have critical mass here, and most importantly, I think we have the staff who are on point for this next section. So reorienting our brains just a little bit, still in the realm of goal 10 and planning for all of the sort of goals and objectives we have on this. DLCD staff are going to orient us a little bit more about compliance for Goal 10, what that means in the context for cities to comply with the program, and talk to you just a little bit about how that works into the work we are talking with you today, and then we'll be talking to you about in the future as well. And we'll have a little time for clarification, and we'll have some additional sort of reflections before we wrap up and finish today. So with that, I think I forgot to clarify who's doing this, but I think it might be Thea. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, I will be jumping in. And Mari, are you going to share screen? Thank you so much. So taking a big step back, I wanted to spend a little while reorienting us around Goal 10, because we're going to be in sort of the next phase of this work, jumping into a conversation about compliance pathways through the Goal 10 process. For this, it really feels important to make sure everybody's on the same page and understands sort of the basic steps that a city has to take to pass go, basically, and also to just take a minute to answer any questions. And things have been changing, so bring everybody up to date. We can go to the next slide, Maddie. So there has been a commitment to provide housing need, provide for the housing need of all Oregonians since establishment of the statewide land use planning system in Oregon in 1973. It's enshrined in the text of the goal. But it hasn't changed since 1973 when that was established, or it hadn't until very recently. It became clear over time that we were sort of approaching housing planning as a state in a way that wasn't truly meeting the needs of the Oregonians that it was meant to meet. And part of that was because it was set up as essentially as a math equation. So what you see here was the former Goal 10 process. Essentially a math equation that aligns land capacity and projected housing need. After a while, this really exposed some very real problems, and among them, vital needs were not being met, particularly for communities that were traditionally marginalized. But as you all know, we have this massive housing shortage. So there was clearly a problem with our calculation. There's also the part of the issue was that the equation essentially takes past production patterns and projects them into the future. So we sort of keep reinventing the same problem that we're trying to overcome. Many of you have followed the recent legislative efforts to address Goal 10, most significantly HB 2003 in 2019 and HB 2001 in 2023 last year. the year before last year. It was still January, man. Okay. They really reorganized Goal 10 planning obligations in significant ways. And Maddie, you can go to the next slide. So what you see here is the new and improved Goal 10 process. I'm not going to walk you through every step of this. If you have hung with DLCD for a while, you've seen this slide before. And it's worth taking some time to sort of just go through, and you'll be able to pick out a lot of the steps that that we've talked about. But critically, some of the new Goal 10 planning work has resulted in an obligation for the state to provide critical housing production data, including targets and tracking. And Maddie, you can advance the slide. So that, and also a requirement for cities to conduct a really nuanced and contextual analysis of the housing need in their community. This we're kind of trying to section off so that to make this a little bit more simple. These belong in a category called, we're calling, determining housing need. We can advance the slides, Maddie. And then to respond to those needs with specific plans to address them. So via, both land use and production strategies, and including a real commitment to affirmatively further fair housing. So that's this middle section here, local actions that respond to need. And finally, adding in a framework for local and state partnership when a jurisdiction is really facing significant barriers to production and falling behind. And that comes with carrots and sticks to get a city to move closer to their production targets. So bringing this back to today's discussion and where we're going to be taking this conversation going forward, one thing we're going to be keeping in mind is how ARAs, how adoption-ready actions can be used with the most impact and the most alignment with the policy objectives all across this Goal 10 program in needs identification, actions to respond to need, and tracking and monitoring and accelerating. There's another sort of half of this work that we're tasked with doing, which is providing pathways for cities to get through this obligation, this Goal 10 planning project. And up to this point, cities have largely been left on their own to their own devices to complete and comply with these requirements. DLCD has always erred on the side of less prescriptiveness. And we have heard clearly that it puts a lot of work and a lot of pressure on cities. So the other half of this project that we'll be working on in HOG is to build in some legal certainty, resources for cities, and kind of clarity of expectations for people who live in them. How we do that is a big open question. And I'm going to hand it over to Celestina to talk to us a little bit about potential pathways that we could build out in the next sort of few months of this work.
Thank you so much, Thea. So on the next slide, we can start to look at what is more or less a spectrum of compliance pathways, ways that local government can engage in housing planning programming just on a theoretical level, and on some examples of various types of housing policy or housing programming that represents these different compliance pathways. And so just to reiterate what Thea just said, it is, the work of this 2025 rulemaking to land on some of these and apply them to the Goal 10 program to create this a clearer or more predictable and more defined compliance pathway. And the reason I say that part is because the rules that were adopted by the Land Conservation and Development Commission in December are fully operational, and a local government can use them and complete their Goal 10 work. So the work that we're doing this year is to see what we might develop in terms of a more predefined pathway to compliance. So that's where we get kind of further on the right side of the spectrum of compliance pathways. But just for context and orientation, I'm going to start kind of on the left-hand side here. There is on the spectrum, the idea that DLCD provides no additional support beyond Oregon administrative rules for a city to complete their Goal 10 work in a city or county, and a local government just uses the rules in order to complete their obligations and reach compliance. That is not on the table for this scope of work. We know that we are producing at a minimum guidance documents, and that was already the case even before this addition to our rulemaking charge for 2025. So that brings us to the second option, which is guidance materials. So guidance materials are optional. They don't provide any legal certainty, but they do support a local government who would like more insights or more guidance. And so an example of that is that there is guidance on accessory dwelling units. And I believe we have a model code, for example, that's available but it's not required in any way. So that in that regard functions just as guidance. Then we start to get into some of the compliance pathways that we started to open up a little bit last year and then sort of parked for this year's work that have more certainty and in some cases more prescription. So one of the terms that we've used often and that we did define in the Oregon Administrative Rules last year is safe harbor. And the safe harbor is a program design tool that still is optional, but is written into the rules and by definition and by design constitutes compliance, at least for whatever portion of the programming that the safe harbor is designed to fill. And the reason I say that part is because there could be places in the Goal 10 program where we have specific safe harbors, whereas other places in the program there are minimum compliance standards, for example. So we don't have to be thinking about these necessarily as a one-size-fits-all, but we could also be contemplating it that way. But again, it's available as an optional pathway, and if a local government decides to use a safe harbor to reach compliance for a part of the Goal 10 program, then that's a reliable pathway in that regard for approval of that portion of the work. Now, rebuttable presumption is very similar, but sort of flips the default. So in the safe harbor, the default is sort of a DIY path, and the option is framed as the safe harbor that you can opt into. Whereas for a rebuttable presumption, we presume that this is the case and this is the pathway for a local government, but you can rebut that and make a case to say, actually, we think that this is the more appropriate pathway rather than that presumed point A or path A. So then we come to a little bit more regulation, which would be minimum compliance standards. So it would be to say that, none of this is optional and you can't rebut it in terms of whatever constitutes the minimum compliance standards. These are minimums, but you could exceed, or there is room within this program framework to do more. But at a minimum, these things must be done in order to comply with this part of a program. And then lastly would be regulatory requirement, which doesn't leave any room for anything beyond and just says, this is what you have to do for this part of the program, period, full stop. The program design theory in that regard would be that there isn't really anything beyond, or anything beyond this requirement might actually obscure what we're trying to do. And so that would be used in any circumstance where, you really feel like exactly what needs to occur has already been fully defined, and that's a regulatory requirement. So hopefully that helps paint a picture of when we use the term compliance pathways, we're not trying to be vague, but we are trying to encompass the fact that there are a lot of different ways to design programming and to design this more predefined pathway through Goal 10 housing planning. So that's overall, but the one thing I want to add is how that links up to what Thea just presented, which is those three Goal 10 parts of the program, and then also how that relates to the adoption ready actions conversation that we had earlier. So the goal of the HOG is to develop, one of the primary goals is to develop these additional compliance pathways through the entirety of the Goal 10 program. From identifying housing needs, step 1. Maybe Mari, if you could go back to the last slide while I talk about this part, that might actually be helpful. So, taking one or more of those compliance pathway tools and applying them to the step where local government determines their housing need. Assessing what kind of compliance pathway would be best for selecting local actions to respond to the need. And then third, a compliance pathway for that acceleration program, that tracking and monitoring progress. Now, the adoption ready actions piece is kind of further a subset in that the actions portion of the program are just those second and third sections. So determining housing need isn't about selecting actions just yet. It certainly is a major influential factor, but adoption ready actions really have the opportunity to be operationalized in that middle third, local actions responding to need, and in that third, the acceleration program and what kind of supports are pursued in terms of getting closer to meeting those housing needs. So the determining housing need portion of the compliance pathways will kind of need its own conversation, and we'll want to ground into that the next time we meet around how we conceptualize compliance pathways for that first third of the programming. And that being said, I don't want to portray adoption ready actions or the application of them as the only way that we can think of ways to get through even the second and third parts of the program. They can be applied in a way where certain adoption ready actions or a combination of them could constitute some form of compliance. And also, there are ways that even actions that aren't developed to adoption readiness can play a role in compliance pathways. So we're not limited to just whatever set of actions we are able to develop to adoption readiness this year in terms of building out what it looks like to get from beginning to end for a local government. I know that was a lot of information and graphs, but I might pause there for clarifying questions.
Great. Thank you, Thea and Celestina. Questions about the compliance framework, about the processes cities have to go through, or how this fits into our work ahead? Yeah, Cassidy.
Sorry. I just want to make sure I understood. So the ARAs that we're participating in generating are going to be used as, I guess, safe harbor tools for jurisdictions to select. And my question, assuming that's a yes, is how do we make sure that there's efficacy in those? Do they get tested or measured later? Is that part of the conversation we're going to have when we frame them? Because I would hate for us all to go through this effort to create a bunch of ARAs that don't actually do what we're tasked with trying to do.
Important questions. I saw Ethan came off camera. I'm wondering if he might want to take the first stab at that. Is that possible, Ethan?
Sure, yeah. Thanks. I think it's when we're talking about the tools at our disposal and what this work group is here to tackle, it's to begin crafting the kind of universe of opportunities for local governments to navigate that space, both in all three of those phases that Celestina is talking about: determination of needs, action selection, and tracking and monitoring. When we're talking about ARAs, adoption ready actions in particular, as a subset of tools within that universe of guidance resources, tools, safe harbors, all of those things, as if we're viewing all of those as support to local governments to navigate this goal 10 planning process. ARAs are kind of like those, like these ones are really great. Like we can really take these pretty much all the way to the end. We feel like these ones in particular, these policies achieve all of these policy objectives that we've talked about, and we all kind of collectively agree are the right policy objectives. And oh, by the way, we can bring those, to a certain extent across the finish line or nearly across the finish line for local governments to boot. And so it's not necessarily that we're only focusing on ARAs and we're only focusing on safe harbors. It's kind of like which ones fall into these categories that are going to be most useful and achieve the policy objectives the best. I hope that answered the question, Cassidy. Let me know if it didn't. Or Celestina, please jump in.
I think maybe if I were to try and distill it down, the answer is they could be, and we've heard many folks say that they think they should be in the process so far, that would be a good use of the adoption ready actions, is to apply them to one of these stronger parts of the compliance pathways, like a safe harbor. But that, absolute decision has not yet been made, and where they fall in terms of how they are applied to compliance is to be determined. And then to the question about updating and efficacy, I think that's a great one and something that we'll want to continue, especially as we get more into the kind of nitty gritty of the rule language and kind of program design, is what kind of updating, frequency is needed for adoption ready actions. And we know that the commission is really oriented to like efficacy and revisiting whatever we draft as our best first go. But I think to raise the question is very astute.
And I think on that point about that Celestina is making, sorry, Thea, the point that Celestina is making about, should they not, how are they going to be used? I think that's distinctly this working group's, what you're here to help us determine, right? And make those recommendations on how that fits in, how these adoption ready actions plug into a safe harbor environment, how they plug into adoption ready action selection, how that has an impact on that kind of tracking and monitoring piece of this program. Like all of those questions are what we're seeking your assistance with, and hope you can help us work through.
Yeah, I was just going to say 100% agree with both my colleagues here, and very much think that sort of continuing to study the efficacy is critical to the success of this program. And also just to say, it is possible that we will be developing ARAs that do not plug into a compliance pathway necessarily. We don't know that, but that is a possibility. If there is a need, or if there's clearly something that we could do that's really impactful and useful, but it doesn't fit into one of these, there's no reason that we can't put some energy toward developing that out.
I'll just add too, I think it's implied, but our team is also doing research about some of the things other states have done that are starting to show some effectiveness, talking to lots of folks over the last few years, and you all to keep checking in on that. But yeah, that is the intent. Thank you for asking the question, Cassidy. Mary Kyle.
We've been talking about ARAs in the abstract for some months now, and I think that feeds into the fears and hopes we all have for them, and it would be nice to actually start talking about them, because here's how I think of it, and you can tell me this is even within the realm. If they are to be truly like, off the shelf ready, meaning, maybe different cities might plug in 10% or 20% or something, there may be a little bit of variation, but they're really going to be off the shelf ready. And let's say we're looking at the category of affordability, because we know every city is going to be falling short on affordability. So there may be a couple or three, I don't know, ARAs that are developed that are really, plug and play. But then there's going to be other tools that are not as well developed. Maybe there isn't just a model ordinance, but they're good ideas that have worked in other places, but should be left for a city to kind of massage and bring forth to the department as, okay, we're going to pick these two ARAs for affordability, but we have these other two ideas. Do you think, does this look like we're good to go on this affordability as highlighted by the target numbers that we've been given, for various socioeconomic categories. So that's kind of how I see that. Not if they're really plug and play, they're not going to fill every need, and they may fill part of a need, right? Like affordability or accessibility. There may be some plug and plays, but you still need a little bit more, and that's where there's city flexibility in playing around this. And then also, as I recall, the statute always gives cities the possibility of coming forth and saying, that's not going to work for us, but we have these other three great ideas. So at least that's how I'm thinking of it. But until we start talking about them, we're all just kind of speculating. And fearing and hoping.
Well, I think it's, Mary Kyle, if I could keep going on that, I think there's additional questions in there too, right? You raise some even in your points there about, are we talking about adoption ready actions? Should you identify some need in your contextualized housing need?
Right.
Does that mean that you are then required to take particular adoption ready actions as a local government? Or are we saying, if you have that need, here are some adoption ready actions that you could pull from? That's a question that we're hoping that you all can help us navigate.
There's a structure, and then there's what we put inside the structure. Those are two different things, and we sometimes start collapsing them. I would prefer to have them separated, but we still haven't known like what goes in them. ARAs. We haven't actually taken one, looked at it, thought about it. And then is that ARA, let's say it's a plug and play, is it mandatory in certain circumstances? Or is it always an option? That's the structure. So I get it. Yeah. But we don't have much time.
Just to quickly tack onto that, yes, we don't have much time, and that was exactly what I was going to say, is that we're actually going to have to find a way to engage in some of those conversations simultaneously. What I mean by that is trying to develop the adoption ready actions themselves at the same time as we orient to how they might be used, and we won't have the luxury of knowing one or the other in full to inform the other. So it is a fairly dynamic landscape in that way. But we can take kind of learnings as we're going along, or indications of this adoption ready action, seems like it might lend itself well to this application, or vice versa.
Thank you. Brock, go ahead.
I was going to agree with Mary Kyle here. I think we need to start looking at the actions themselves, right? We can say whether or not we want to produce guidance, safe harbors, rebuttable presumptions, whatever. But until we know what they are, until we know the details of them, we don't know how they're going to fit into the rest of the system. So let's start talking about the options. Let's see what we can get to. And then once we have something that's ready, let's see where it fits and where we can plug it in if that's appropriate, right? But I think if we start from the standpoint of, okay, we want guidance here, safe harbor here, but we don't really know what any of them are, we're not going to get anywhere. So I agree with Mary Kyle. Let's start talking about the policy, and then we can figure out if and where to plug it in.
I think I would encourage us to think about today as the first step of doing that distinctly. We've got, limited amount of time, and we are going to take the conversation that you all and that Mira board is going to be a incredibly valuable resource as we move through this next phase of bringing you all some things to chew on, like you're talking about, Mary Kyle and Brock. And then, we're refining from there. The months, February, March, April, really are going to be like, let's think through alternatives. Let's refine. Let's go back to the well, dive deeper, and, coming to the end of this process with some good recommendations that we can, really kind of, we're even further than refining, alternative, kind of approach. We're really like polishing in the latter part of summer towards the end of 2025 as we're getting closer to adoption and incorporation of those into the Division 8 process. So, and Division 24. But yeah, so we hear you.
It's a good thank you, Ethan, for mentioning that too, and for Brock and Mary Kyle. It's a good opportunity just for those of you who've been with us the last year. The pace and content of meetings will be a little different this year. So the next time we will be bringing you, it's not little bits and pieces along the way. We'll be bringing you sort of whole concepts to sort of consider and chew on. So we'll be getting those specifics faster. And more completely for this group to work through, because we do have limited time. Gus, please.
Thank you. I agree with Ethan that this is just a great starting point to start considering what those ARAs look like. And one of the things that made me think about a recent conversation I had with my CPA and my attorney about how we proceed under certain conditions of a development we're doing, and just having all of that horsepower in that conversation was fantastic. And I feel like we have that here too. So we've got all of this collaboration going on. It's difficult, I feel like, because there's so much horsepower that you can't really get to a spot where you can actually utilize it well. Maybe there's a way we could, do like work groups, or maybe there's a way that we could do everybody bring back their best two concepts. Like I'm thinking about for our city specifically, our planner is great, and he knows that he has an arduous task ahead of him. I'd like that not to be scary for him. I'd like it to be like, this is really exciting because we're all here to try to make this better. We're not here to try to penalize you for not doing your job. And then here are two ways that I think we could use like positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement for that city to be able to make progress. And the progress that needs to be made is serious, right? So we can't just rely on goodwill for that to happen. I mean, there needs to be some metrics in place, but so I just like what we're doing here. I think there's a lot of potential, and I'm looking forward to being able to assist in those areas.
Thanks, Gus. Appreciate that. Your comment about having a lot of horsepower just like gave me this image of a horse and buggy just sort of taking off, like some dramatic scene from Little House on the Prairie or something. But agreed and fully hear you. We'll go back to our project team and sort of talk about how to harness that best going forward here. Totally hear you on that, and how to make sure we are getting the most out of the expertise and intelligence in this room. Other questions or comments about the compliance pathways? Okay, excellent. Well, I think we're at the point where it's time to wrap up. I like to take a couple of moments to do a few things to make our conversations going forward that much richer. One is to reflect on how well we did in thinking about the racial equity framework, and maybe improvements we can make in the future, or how we can support you in thinking about that. And then just generally reflect on the meeting. You've offered some of that already, but if there are other thoughts about how we meet and how we come together, now is a good time to share that as well. But before we get there, maybe just often we have Commissioner Lazo, who does an amazing job at sort of highlighting for us where we are in the racial equity framework. He's on vacation today, but we'll get him next time. But anyone have thoughts they'd like to share about our discussion as it relates to racial equity? Do you think we came closer than usual? Still a lot of work to do. Did you find yourselves thinking about it as you were entering things in the Miro board? Yeah, thanks, Shannon. Break the awkward silence. You're on mute.
Sure, thanks. I think I have maybe a process question. So in reading the packet leading up to today, I feel like there was an allusion to maybe some other stakeholder engagement outside of this group of the HOG. And as I think about racial equity, it seems to me like that might be a prudent step to take and perhaps something already in the works. And I just thought I'd explicitly ask.
You're wondering about if there is other engagement outside of these work groups to talk about these things. Great, I'll leave it to staff to respond. Anyone?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, and here's kind of the quick snapshot that I can offer. So one of the things that we've been trying to think about, not only in terms of housing planning engagement, but also in terms of our process here, of course, is being mindful of engagement fatigue and putting engagement we've already received into action. So when I talk about that, I'm thinking specifically about the engagement tool of focus groups. So we conducted a few focus groups oriented to fair housing questions, and I forget what the other title was, but it was to give voices, focus on voices who were not represented or didn't have the capacity to really participate in the advisory groups last year. And the approach that we're taking currently is to really focus on actioning on a lot of the feedback we heard in this year's work, because a lot of it is the same or related almost, and really bringing things into our rules and these compliance pathways without going back to folks and asking very similar questions. So there's that piece. That being said, there are still going to be opportunities for other folks to engage, but we are keeping a little bit of a lighter touch and trying to hold ourselves accountable actually to implementing feedback that we already heard from our engagement efforts last year. And I believe we might be able to follow up with some links to our engagement report from last year's rulemaking as well, if that would be of interest. So that's just a short answer.
Yeah, thanks. That's just trying to stay mindful about like who's not around the table, who's maybe not in the room, and really sounds like there's a thoughtful approach to make sure that engagement that's already taken place is going to move forward in productive ways. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think one example of that are some of the ideas that were on the Miro board when you got in there. It first came from that engagement of the last year, sort of brought forward, and the staff are really thinking about how to build on that and keep expanding on that. Kathy, please.
I think we did not talk all that much about the racial equity framework. And I think it's in part because we're thinking in technical ways to address housing types and communities. I think the one that I remember mentioning was equity building and reparations-based home ownership opportunities. And I think we've kind of touched on that a little bit, but we haven't delved into it, in part because of the scope of our task.
Yep, you're right. And fair enough too. So I think we have, yes, Garland, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I put something on the Miro board around rent as theft, right? And like how I might react to this. But some backstory on this concept is that this concept comes out of Black and Brown communities in Los Angeles region in particular. And if you look at the demographics of who's the landlord versus who's a renter, there's definitely a racial component to that. And so that was part of my why for putting that onto the Miro board, is to uplift that idea in a space where it may not otherwise be discussed. And I think that one of the things that comes up for me around this is that some of these ideas that we may need to center to really do something about racial equity, not just talk about it, but actually make a real difference in the world. So the theme of our conversation today is we may have to be willing to discuss ideas that make us uncomfortable. And this is one of those ideas. And so, it's not necessarily part of our scope, except that centering racial equity is part of our scope. And to the extent that means that we need to have uncomfortable conversations, I guess I volunteer to say I'm here for that. Like, let's put on our grown-up pants and have uncomfortable conversations. The time is now to do that. And if this is not the exact space for taking those conversations to their logical conclusions, whatever those may be, that's also, I think, the work of this group, is to figure out, well, what is the right space? If not here, then where? If not now, then when?
Thank you. And thank you for adding that, thinking about that as you were adding into the Miro board. Which brings us to a good point to talk about some next steps. And before we close, I can make sure I didn't miss any additional comments. Oh, sorry, Ethan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Deb. Garland, I appreciate your comment. It's got me thinking about just how we proceed, as a work group, but with the project team, knowing that DLCD is in this recommending role to Land Conservation Development Commission that ultimately will adopt whatever we're discussing here, or a version of that. And I think really where that rubber meets the road, so to speak, in the conversation here in this room, and how this conversation gets translated into a set of recommended rules for LCDC, is that discussion of benefits and burdens of the particular things that we're talking about here. And I guess that's just a call for you all work group members, about holding DLCD accountable to keeping that at the fore, because it's going to be really easy, or unfortunately, just due to the time that we've got here, these 6 months, 5 months at this point, to say, well, we just can't get to it, or ongoing conversation is needed. And so when we are actually getting to that point of making those recommendations, it's going to be really important for you all to keep us accountable to that racial equity framework and these goals that we've all talked about here. So thank you. And we welcome that.
Yeah, maybe I'll add here,
go ahead.
Just to underscore that point, because I also appreciate that comment, Garland, and I appreciated the way that you described your thinking in terms of what came about for that action you put on the Miro board. That's the thinking that we are asking of you all when we say lean into the racial equity framework and the categories within, is as you're engaging in this conversation, as you're engaging in the activities, and you're considering what you're putting forward, applying that racial equity framework in your thinking and your and what you're bringing forward is exactly it. As well as we're having that lens, but it is a mutual. I think Thea might have said this in her intro at the orientation, that as the agency is being held accountable to the racial equity framework, because that is adopted by our LCDC, we are sharing that responsibility with this group, and so it is a mutual responsibility. So Garland, please do. And the questions about when we're down the road about maybe more refined ARA and how that has benefit or burden, and how to be responsive and address that is more than welcome. We'll be doing that on our back end, but on the back end. But yeah, if we can share that with you all, because there's expertise and equity champions in this room, even better. Thank you.
Thank you, Madi. And I think, yeah, really thinking about which of these actions will help cities address some longstanding and current issues that are negatively impacting people of color. I think that will go a long way among the other sort of groups that are often marginalized or locked out of housing choice. So thank you. Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, just a question for staff. Would it be possible to get just like a bullet list PDF of the various suggestions that have been put up on the Miro board? I mean, maybe by the end of the week, if we can just like copy and paste them over, even just for everyone to look at, so we're all looking at the same thing and not having to bounce around between different sites and stuff like that.
I do not think we will have that to you by the end of the week. The Miro board, however, next steps include the Miro board remaining open for a little bit. The fact that this will get distilled into, a Word document and sorted will definitely happen and will likely be in future meeting materials. But I don't think we can commit to when that will be, but the Miro board will be available to continue to add to, and then we can have it available for viewing after that. And then eventually we will get to that distilling phase.
Yeah, partially, Brock, because it will be open for about a week. So we want to let that sort of iterate and percolate until that time. So and
maybe next week, but not soon.
Yeah, maybe.
I wonder, just sorry, and this is like on the fly, but I wonder if there's a need to there's a clear need to like close off the editing, so that we can distill and operationalize those ideas and move on those. But is there a reason why we need to like close off access at all, and we can just kind of keep that up and available, and it's at the same link, and you can always go there and take a look at it? Wonder if we could do that.
Long as folks really don't add anything. Because we tried that last year and we did get some things added. There's no way we can that we know of that we can fully lock it down. And it's not because we don't want to hear from you, but it's because we won't be looking for additional information. So it actually would just kind of be like a black hole of your comment, which we don't want. So once we close down for comments, anything that comes to you later, email us, bring it up in a meeting, something like that. But we just definitely don't want to have somebody add something and think that it's going to make our way to us, and it doesn't. So other than that, Ethan, I think we can definitely do that.
It's a lot of ideas in a busy board, and we don't want things to go missing. Okay, I believe the intent is to follow up. You all will receive an email. Those who aren't here will get the same email with the link to the Miro board in case you lose track of it. Along the way, you'll have that. And it'll say in the email, it'll be open through Monday to keep adding your thumbs up and new ideas. I encourage, because new ideas could be added throughout the week, I encourage you all to check in on it again, because there might be some new ideas that you want to interface with or just sort of see yourselves. And then, yeah, then we'll be using that to sort of move along and figuring out which of these ideas combine it with research and think about which ones are on the best path toward adoption-ready actions. Any other next steps that I've missed, gang? It's getting late in the day. My brain is getting really soft. I'm sorry for that. We get it?
Say maybe just a reminder, and you all have this in your calendar, but if you don't, send us an email. Next meetings are mid-February, February 19th, 9 a.m. to noon. So that'll be an early time with us. And Wednesday, February 26th from 9 to 11 a.m. So we're doing our best to package everything ahead of those meetings so that you all can come prepared to dive in, because we will be digging in. So I think that's the last bit.
Thank you for those reminders. Fantastic. And then, of course, staff on the agenda, there's an email address you can always send questions or comments to. That's the best one where they can collect. And if you have any sort of process questions, you're welcome to ping me and we can have a conversation, sort out anything that needs to be sorted. So really appreciate you all being here and bringing your best and sticking with us. And until next time. And
Good to
Shannon,
see you all. And maybe at some point before this process ends, we can all to get together in person for a happy hour or something. It's such an awesome collection of people. If we could do that, that would be amazing.
Love that idea.
yeah.
Good to see you all. Bye for now.
Everybody.
Yeah.